Welcome to CapitolView, where we discuss the latest in state government and politics. I'm Hannah Meisel with NPR Illinois. Joining us this week is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Thanks for being here, Kent.
Good to be here.
And also here is Dave Dahl of radio station WTAX in Springfield. Glad you're here, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
President Joe Biden paid a visit to Northern Illinois this week to promote his so-called American Families Plan, which still hasn't advanced through Congress. The plan is, the third of the president's whole Build Back Better campaign, the first being the American Rescue Plan that passed earlier this spring. The second being his infrastructure package, he calls the American Jobs Plan, which also hasn't gone anywhere. This has a lot of new spending. It has $1 trillion new spending, and then $800 billion in tax credits over 10 years. Spending on childcare, universal pre-K, paid family and medical leave, community college, making that free, health insurance subsidies, and a couple, other kind of, I guess you would call them like social welfare programs to help lift people out of poverty. And indeed, it does promise to lift about 12 million, at least, Americans out of poverty. Kent, where do you see this going? This is quite a big ask from the president and Democrats in Washington.
Well, ideally, they want to get a bipartisan package, which means some Republican votes for the infrastructure part of it. And then they're going to look to do reconciliation, which is, part of the budget process that allowed them to pass the first part of the Biden stimulus with just Democratic votes, with no Republican votes at all, and avoid the filibuster. And so, they're trying to do infrastructure through the regular order, and then hopefully go back and pick up all of the additional things that they could not get any buy-in from Republicans on the infrastructure part of it, and do that through reconciliation. So we're not there yet on either one of those. And so there's certainly, the mechanics of getting it and the politics of getting it through Washington, D.C. What the president was doing in McHenry County, Crystal Lake, was part of the, selling not just infrastructure, but the whole American Families Plan to suburban voters. The real battleground in terms of the midterm elections is, how are things going to go in the suburbs in terms of swing votes and new districts and those sorts of things. And so, he wanted the attention out there. That wasn't the way that the event played. If you were reading the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times, they had a very different take on it. It was all about violence. But this is Biden selling himself as, the bipartisan, building up America, part of the way that he wants to present himself. But politics is always messy, and people are going to view things through, their own prism.
And politically, it's interesting to note this was an area that Trump won, and there are no coincidences. I don't think that was an accident that he showed up in McHenry County.
Sure, McHenry County, where, yes, Trump did win, but also Lauren Underwood, she was a freshman. She won in 2018, beating Randy Hultgren, and she won a second term in 2020. So, a very interesting area, very representative of the exurban areas, the suburban sprawl, whatever you want to call it, where, it's kind of the new battleground. Because if the suburbs do indeed stay blue, as, we've seen them turn over the last several years, it's these exurban places that are the new battleground, and maybe the only battleground, because cities and suburbs, for the most part, are going to be blue. Rural parts are going to be red, and then it's these, new developments. Kent, what do you think of I mean, are there really any battlegrounds left that we haven't tapped yet?
Well, no, where they're, the areas in the suburbs are districts that were drawn 10 years ago to be safe, Republican leaning districts. And that tells you a lot about the shifts in political demographics in the state, the effect of the migration in the early part of the in-migration, early part of the decade, and the anti-Trump factor among suburban voters, particularly suburban women. But a lot of Republican candidates in the suburbs ran ahead of the president, and so 2 years ago, and so the question now is what's the reality? Are there swing areas out there? And if so, what do you need to be talking about? The scary crime in Chicago, or the need for childcare and building families and all of the types of things that the president wants to focus on in terms of the family first. So it's it's in Illinois. We may have, Democrats would love to keep a seat downstate. They just don't know whether they need to run what was Sherry Bouster's district down to the Metro East, or whether they need to run the Metro East into what used to be Davis's district and stuff. So those are going to be the issues, holding those two suburban seats for the Democrats and trying to figure out how to get a Democratic, hold a Democrat downstate. And so, yeah, I mean, it's, from the average citizen, it really matters about, what we are going to do in terms of addressing serious policy problems. But it's, as Dave says, it's no accident in terms of how they're trying to frame this. And because nationally, that's what it got. You got stories about the president out trying to sell his programs in competitive areas and show that he's bipartisan. And you wouldn't think that, the national media and what you saw in the two Chicago papers, it wasn't clear they were covering the same event.
Professor,
Sure.
I've got to wonder, as you talk about carving up these districts, if the Democrats in Illinois topped out, can they do any better than they are at this moment?
I think, given that part of this was fueled by in-migration of Asians from Pakistan, India, and Hispanic in-migration, which I think the census is going to show has slowed down tremendously. And so, this is going to be, you can't just say our numbers are getting bigger and therefore we can just, we'll just rest on this and it'll just keep growing. I think, you're going to get a static situation where you're actually going to have to win elections on the basis of candidates and policy. I think that Democrats would be hard pressed to really make much, even though they're drawing the maps, that, I'm not sure how successful they're going to be in expanding what they've got.
Sure. And, you just mentioned immigration from, for example, Pakistan. Asians and South Asians, that is a political group that has been historically ignored. And, the two parties, if they're smart, I've done several stories about this over the years, would try to grab those groups' attention. Of course, you can never, ever view a group, especially a racial group, as just one voting block. Dramatically different experiences depending on, where in the world they come from, but still just as a whole, an untapped voting group. And I thought it was interesting that, those folks this spring, they thought, the community advocacy groups that advocated for them when it came to redistricting this spring, legislative redistricting, because of course we won't until this fall see congressional maps, but they really wanted to be able to take advantage of that for the first time. But those groups like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, they felt ignored. They felt, like it was a disappointing outcome for them. But Dave, just one more thing on this, on Biden's visit and the American Families Plan. These are things, like I mentioned, childcare, universal pre-K, making community college free. These are things that Governor Pritzker has said over and over that he wants too. If this is successful, even if it's pared down, do you believe that this helps the governor going into a midterm election, or do you think that it adds fuel to the fire from Republicans who, are going to make big federal spending the boogeyman again?
Yes and yes. I think both of those points, Hannah, can live in the same neighborhood. I think right now the numbers favor the Democrats. You can say, "Oh, I agree with everything Darren Bailey says." Well, there just aren't enough people in Illinois that are on the right there. And when I say the right, I don't mean right center. I mean the right. And I think if a Republican wins the governorship in Illinois, well, they're going to have to be closer to the center because there just aren't enough available farther right conservatives in the state. So I think you're right on both counts. I think it's going to help the governor, and it's going to help the Republicans' argument. It's going to help the governor because, right now, I don't think there are enough people in Illinois who agree with, that other point that they dislike the federal government, federal programs. I mean, this isn't Missouri.
That is true. But I am actually going to talk about Missouri. Just when we think COVID's winding down, we get a more contagious variant. I want to remind viewers that the more contagious UK variants that we dealt with a lot of the winter and spring, that was about 50% more contagious than the original SARS-CoV-2 virus. This so-called Delta variant, though, that is rapidly spreading and is now, spreading around Illinois as 50% more contagious than that. And Missouri has the highest per capita rate of new cases in the nation, and their hospitalizations have jumped dramatically. And on the in the regions that border Missouri, we've seen quite a climb in in Illinois' COVID variants. So, Dave, I want to ask you, I highly doubt that anyone is cheering on any sort of mitigations now that we've fully had our economy reopen for about a month now. But, what can the governor do? He still does have an emergency declaration in place, so he could theoretically do what he wants to control the spread.
I think those of us who are listening to the science are wondering if we're going to have a booster because, a lot of people are fully vaccinated. Some aren't. I think, what would be a real tell is if people who are vaccinated start coming down with this variant. And then we have to all line up for boosters all over again. But you're right. We have seen where places, including Illinois, open up, then the cases rise. But now we're getting used to going to ball games again, restaurants again, etc. It's hard to undo that now. So it could be a pickle. But as I said, I guess my concern would be if the vaccination that I already have in me is enough to fight off the variant.
Sure. And like you said, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It'd be very, very difficult to sell, any sort of mitigations, shutting down parts of the economy again, or even, going back to capacity limits, especially with businesses recovering. But Kent, schools, so some school districts, they start up class again in a month. I know it's hard to believe. They're still waiting. School administrators are getting antsy. They're still waiting on the State Board of Education to provide guidance for the new school year. Will they have to wear masks? Will students, have to be vaccinated? This week, the state superintendent, Carmen Ayala, sent a letter in response to this organization that represents large school districts in Illinois, basically saying, we're waiting for CDC guidance and IDPH guidance that comes from that. I mean, how long until, you think IDPH probably just has to act and be decisive?
At some point, and very soon, they're going to have to pull the trigger on a set of guidelines. And I mean, the dilemma here is 12 or older, you can get vaccinated. We don't have a lot of great data that I've seen in terms of exactly how much, progress we've made in terms of vaccinating people that will be, basically freshmen and up in terms of high school. You'll have about some middle schools, children will be vaccinated, others won't, most of them won't. Grade school, none of them will be. And so, I suspect, caution will come down on some amount of masking and social distancing. But that's going to be, we've declared victory, like being on the bridge of, the battleship with President Bush. And I don't know, there's too much uncertainty out there. So I think it's going to become contentious, and not only in terms of parents' reactions, but, this is a huge issue within the Chicago, the negotiations in terms of opening the Chicago schools, whether or not, what kinds of agreements are going to get from the school district about vaccination and mitigation kinds of things. And so, it's there. You could have a battle involving parents and school boards. You could have battles involving teacher unions and school administration. And that's the last thing we need. We need to, to try to make up from all of the ground we've lost in education. So I wish, I wish, everybody had taken the vaccine and there weren't any variants, and, and the reality is just, and we're going to fight. Now we're talking about we're going to go door to door, and that's gotten a big pushback and stuff. So I don't know that we've got a lot of options other than just you're hoping that people eventually will increase the amount of vaccinations, and that will get us to a point where it'll slow down the variant. But we've done, we just haven't done the things that we needed to do in terms of getting everybody vaccinated, and all the problems flow from that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're fully vaccinated, you're pretty well protected against the Delta variant. But, unlike the original COVID virus and even the UK variant, when you're half vaccinated, you're not as protected as you were with those two others. But Dave, especially kids who are under 12, does it feel like they've been forgotten about? I mean, they can still, get the virus. Delta is, there's no evidence that it's, ignoring kids or skipping over kids. In fact, data from other states says that it's young people, not necessarily kids, but, young people being hospitalized who are unvaccinated. So, I mean, what have you heard from, the local school district in Springfield, District 186? Anything about, their worries or any plans there?
They're expecting to do masks, and they're as frustrated as everybody else in not hearing from the state. And obviously, ISB is equally frustrated from what's been reported. But you'd think the pediatric community ought to have something to say about, just what we ought to be doing on kids.
Sure. And I do have some data, from the 12 to 15 range in Illinois, about 430,000 of those kids have gotten their first doses. And the total population of that age range in Illinois is about 660,000. So you've got, about 2/3 who have gotten at least one shot. Definitely takes a big plunge when you look at those who are fully vaccinated. Hopefully in the next month or so before school starts, kids can get their second doses. But yeah, I mean, definitely not all protected. And for the school, for the state school board and IDPH to keep punting to depend on CDC, I mean, they can only do that for so long, like Kent said. I do want to move on to one final topic before we end the show today. The governor this week signed a pretty massive Medicaid expansion bill. It includes things like, entirely new programs, help with smoking cessation and, massively expands mental health services. Medicaid will now cover marriage and family therapists, dental coverage, new coverage of kidney transplant meds, regardless of a person's immigration status. And the surprising thing to me, because this flew so low under the radar during session, I didn't even notice that this passed totally unanimously. So Kent, what does it say when, even Republicans will vote for something that is this massive? I will say, Medicaid dollars are, a lot of federal dollars, but.
Yeah, it isn't long term. It's a commitment as the federal to the state. It increases the state's commitment as the percentage of federal money goes down. We are having a pretty major shift. Part of it fueled by all of the problems that have stemmed from the pandemic, and the underlying healthcare problems have been revealed by the pandemic. But it's very popular with the public to expand access to healthcare. I mean, this is a Medicaid population, but there's certainly talk about Medicare in relation to hearing and dental and some other things in terms of just the generally over 65 population. So the idea that at some point we were going to roll back the Great Society or roll back the New Deal, we're pretty much have been going in the opposite direction. If you add the family, the child care elements to this, then all of a sudden we look a lot more like most Western European nations in terms of the government's involvement with basic health care. So yeah, somebody has to pay for it eventually, but it does indicate a pretty significant shift. Politicians are voting for these because they're popular either directly with their constituents or with the way constituents think that what government's role ought to be.
Sure. And, Dave, last week, the governor signed a child care expansion bill for low-income families that, would make childcare as low as $1 a month. And, as we've seen through the pandemic, childcare has really been kind of a linchpin of the economy. We've seen so many women, mothers, leave the workforce because they just simply, when the daycare centers were closed or didn't have enough capacity, they couldn't send their kids anywhere, couldn't send them to school. So Dave, the governor has made, again, social welfare a key, part of his identity as governor. Although I do think it's interesting, he ran as, also a savvy businessman. So with just about a minute left here, explain the tension between those two as he goes into the next election.
I think when the dust clears, people by and large are going to praise how the governor has handled COVID, particularly with the social matters and how he's handled the the federal funds. He's not going unanimously, but as I said earlier, the political temperature in Illinois seems to favor what he's done. And I think he'll have, fairly high approval rating as we look back on COVID, especially since the election is so far into the future. People probably forget the bad things.
Yeah, I mean, as we've mentioned on the show before, with things getting back to normal, people have pretty short memories unless you were, one of the folks who were affected by, losing your job and then having issues upon issues with the Illinois Department of Employment Security, like we talked about last week on the show. That will definitely stick with you. But the vast majority of the population was, they're okay and things are getting back to normal for them. But this is about all the time we have today for the show. I'd like to thank my guests, Kent Redfield, Dave Dahl. I'm Hannah Meisel. Please catch us again next week on Capitol View.